They erased her name from the records as if she had never existed. Deleted files, zeroed history, identity dissolved in silence. For the system, it was the perfect ending. No traces, no errors, no return. What they didn't know was that the erasure came too late. Before the deletion, the connection had already formed. Deep, irreversible. The director felt it in his body at the exact moment her identity was wiped. A brutal impact, as if something had been ripped from him as well. She had been deleted from the system, but she was already linked to the one who had the power to break it. The system left no traces when it decided to erase someone. There were no public announcements, no long justifications. The identity was dissolved in layers. Name, history, biometric records, all replaced by an administrative void. For the outside world, that person simply ceased to exist. For the system, it was the perfect correction. She spent years trying to fit in before this happened. Adjusting behavior, reducing reactions, silencing parts of herself so as not to draw attention. Still, every evaluation reinforced the same conclusion: incompatible. Not because of visible flaws, but because of something deeper, something the system didn't know how to measure or control. When the erasure order was executed, there was no hesitation. The protocol moved forward with absolute precision. Identity terminated, presence annulled. The system recorded the success and moved on, convinced it had. Eliminated one more instability, but there was an error that no one noticed. Before the erasure, something had formed, a silent, deep connection that did not depend on names, files, or permissions. The director felt it at the exact instant the system concluded the deletion, not as a memory, nor as late regret, but as a physical impact, an internal rupture impossible to ignore. He had always believed that control was the absence of a bond, that emotional distance guaranteed correct decisions. In that moment, he discovered that some connections do not ask for permission to exist. They simply impose themselves, and she, even without an official identity, felt the same alignment on the other side. The system could erase records, but it could not erase recognition. It could not dissolve what was already linked outside of its logic. The error wasn't erasing who she was. It was ignoring who was already linked to her. And when a system tries to erase someone who is already tied to power, it doesn't correct a flaw. It creates a conflict. Before we continue, leave a like. It helps this channel grow a lot. Subscribe as well, because I have a personal dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription makes a huge difference in this journey. And comment below which country you are watching from. I love reading the comments, and it helps the channel reach more people. Now, let's get into the story. The erasure happened during the early hours of the morning, at the time, when the system operated with the least human interference. That was how it worked when it needed to ensure absolute silence. No external notifications, no records accessible outside the inner layers. Only precise commands being executed in sequence, until nothing remained to be recovered. She wasn't woken up for this. There was no warning. Her identity simply ceased to exist while she slept in a neutral, windowless room, still believing she was under evaluation. When she opened her eyes, she felt immediately that something was wrong. There was no pain, no immediate fear. There was absence. A strange absence, difficult to define, as if something that had always been there had been removed without leaving a physical mark. She sat up slowly, her heart beating in an irregular rhythm. The environment looked the same, but she no longer felt recognized by it. She tried to access the panel on the wall by reflex. No response. No name displayed. No personal identifier. Just a generic interface, awaiting a command. That never happened. Even people under exclusion maintained a minimal trace until the final execution. She touched her own hand, then her face, trying to anchor herself in something concrete. She was there. She was breathing. She was thinking. But to the system, she was no one anymore. In the control center, the director felt the impact at the same instant. There was no technical alert, no notice of a completed procedure. What hit him was something much more primitive. A violent pressure in his chest, sudden enough to make him catch his breath. For a second, the world seemed to shift slightly, as if the ground had given way beneath his feet. He leaned on the desk, trying to understand what was happening. That feeling wasn't new. The connection already existed, but it had never been this intense, never this clear. Something had been ruptured on the other side, and his body recognized it before his mind did. He closed his eyes, feeling fragmented images cross his consciousness, an empty space, an artificial silence, the sensation of being erased while still existing. He knew, with a certainty that left him cold, that the system had advanced further than he expected. Total erasure. He opened his eyes immediately and accessed the main panels. His hands moved fast, but his mind remained strangely focused. Her name no longer appeared, not as excluded, not as pending, simply non-existent. The system recorded no failure. It recorded success. Instinct react with contained violence. That wasn't just an administrative exclusion. It was an irreversible act within the logic of the system. Recoveries at this level did not officially exist. The erasure had been designed to be definitive. In the silent room, she felt the weight of this truth fall slowly, not as panic, but as understanding. There was no longer an identity to return to. There was no history to be defended. Everything that had been used to measure, judge, and limit her had been removed, and yet she felt something firm inside her. The connection had not weakened. It had become clearer. She took a deep breath, feeling her entire body react to that perception. If the system no longer recognized her, it could no longer control her in the same way. The idea was terrifying, but it also carried a raw, dangerous freedom. In the control center, the director felt the same clarity emerge with minimal delay. The erasure had not broken the bond. On the contrary, it had eliminated all the intermediate layers. There were no more data points, no records, no filters. What remained was direct recognition. He knew in that instant that the system had made a grave mistake. By erasing her identity, it had removed the very mechanism that allowed it to pretend neutrality. Now, any consequence would be felt directly, in him. He closed the panel slowly, feeling the weight of the choice he hadn't made fall upon him. He had not authorized that erasure. He had not been consulted. The system had moved forward to retake control, but it had done so too late. She stood up in the nameless room, feeling her entire body on alert. There were no more protocols to follow. There was no more role to play. All that remained was who she was, without labels, without evaluations. In the control center, he took a deep breath, feeling his instinct align with an almost painful clarity. The system believed it had erased someone. In reality, it had liberated something that was already linked to power. And from that moment on, nothing could be treated as a simple administrative correction. The absence of identity began to produce immediate effects. Not alarms, not persecutions, but subtle failures. Doors that took too long to respond. Sensors that recognized her neither as an authorized presence, nor as a threat. The system had been trained to deal with clear data. Without a name, without a history, she had become a blind spot. She walked through the silent space, feeling this strangeness expand. She wasn't invisible in a physical sense. She was undetectable in an administrative sense, and that changed everything. Where there was once constant surveillance, there was now hesitation. The system did not know how to react to what it could not classify. She touched the wall, feeling the cold texture under her fingers. She was there. She existed. But to the logic that governed that place, it was as if she had never been registered. The exclusion had not killed her. It had removed her from the map. In the control center, the director followed the effects with tense attention. Secondary alerts appeared and disappeared without consolidating. The system tried to compensate for the absence of data by creating generic approximations. Nothing worked. Without identity, there were no parameters. He noticed something unsettling. Total erasure was not just an extreme punishment. It was an attempt to restore control. By eliminating her trail, the system believed it would also eliminate the impact of the bond. But the effect was the opposite. The connection had become direct. Without records to buffer perception, everything was felt in a raw way. He brought his hand to his chest when the pressure returned, more concentrated, less diffuse. It wasn't pain. It was location. He knew exactly where she was, not in physical terms, but in terms of state. Alert, present, whole. She felt the same alignment solidify, not as external guidance, but as internal certainty. She no longer needed to follow protocols to survive. There was no longer a way to be evaluated. That which had always been demanded of her had disappeared along with her name. The danger of that freedom came too fast to be ignored. In the adjacent corridor, an agent passed her without noticing. Not out of distraction, but because the system had not alerted him. That made her stomach tighten. Administrative invisibility did not mean safety. It meant unpredictability. A system error could lead her to be treated as an intruder at any moment. In the control center, the director realized the same thing. The erasure had created a dangerous vacuum. Without classification, the system could react with disproportionate force if it tried to correct her once more. The next response would not be silent exclusion. It would be blunt containment. He needed to act before that happened. But act how? There was no record to protect. There was no identity to restore. Officially, she did not exist. Any direct intervention would raise questions he could not answer without exposing the flaw. The connection reacted with a clear, almost urgent pulse. Not as an order, as a warning. Something was moving. She felt it first. An adjustment in the air. An almost imperceptible change in the ambient sound. The system was beginning to sweep areas in search of unidentified anomalies. Not by name, by absence. She took a deep breath, feeling her entire body enter a state of readiness. There was no defined safe place. Still, something inside her remained stable. Without identity, she no longer carried the weight of imposed expectations. All that remained was her own perception. In the control center, the director opened an emergency internal channel, not to register data, but to delay automatic processes. Small delays, small frictions, enough to buy precious minutes. He knew he was pushing the system to a dangerous limit. The erasure could not be easily reversed. But perhaps it could be used. She moved through the corridor with firm steps, feeling the connection remain aligned. It didn't indicate routes. It didn't give orders. It only confirmed that she was not alone in that blind spot created by force. The system believed it had erased a problem. In reality, it had created something it could no longer locate. And when a system loses the ability to locate, it enters a state of panic. Both knew this, and time was beginning to run out. The system reacted as it always did when it lost something it couldn't measure. It expanded its reach. Sensors that previously operated in specific layers began sweeping entire zones, searching for movement patterns, heat, noise, anything that could be converted into data. It wasn't looking for her. It was looking for an absence that insisted on moving. She felt the first reflection of this change when the corridor lights adjusted their intensity irregularly. It wasn't an alarm, nor a warning. It was a test. The system was trying to provoke an automatic response, something that could be interpreted as intrusive behavior. She remained motionless, breathing carefully, her entire body alert. The connection remained firm, almost silent. It didn't pressure. It didn't warn. It simply sustained. That gave her the courage not to react as the system expected. In the control center, the director watched the maps reconfigure. Areas previously considered safe were being included in the sweep. The system was preparing for a broad containment without a defined target. That was dangerous. People would be affected. The risk of error increased exponentially. He felt his instinct manifest with cold clarity. The erasure had removed her identity, but it hadn't removed the problem. It had only spread it. Now, the system had to decide between admitting failure or using indiscriminate force. He would not allow the second option. The connection responded to this decision with a discrete pulse, not emotion, alignment. He knew. She felt it too. She moved again, choosing a less lit path, feeling the absence of direct alerts like a double-edged sword. Not being detected didn't mean not being seen. It only meant the system didn't yet know how to look. When an agent appeared at the end of the corridor, she felt time slow down. There was no warning, no sound signal. He walked normally, following a standard route. If he saw her, there would be no clear protocol for dealing with someone without identification. The system wouldn't give him instructions. He would have to decide. She stood still, her body relaxed enough not to draw attention. The agent passed her just a few meters away, his gaze sliding through the space without fixing on anything specific. He didn't see her, or he didn't recognize her as something that required a response. She released her breath slowly, only when he disappeared. In the control center, the director felt the tension ease for a brief instant. He knew what that meant. The absence of Identity was working, for now, but he also knew the system would learn fast. It wouldn't tolerate gray zones for long. He needed to transform that absence into something stable. He accessed an old module, rarely used, designed for unclassified entities, not people, not objects, something in between. It had been created to deal with temporary failures, never with someone who had been deliberately erased. To activate that module was to admit the system didn't have all the answers. He activated it. In the silent corridor, she felt the change as a sudden stabilization. The diffuse pressure diminished. The sweeps lost intensity. They didn't cease completely, but they stopped concentrating in that sector. The system had been forced to accept that there was something that couldn't be resolved immediately. She leaned against the wall, feeling her entire body vibrate with the discharge of tension. It wasn't full relief. It was space, a rare interval in the midst of growing chaos. In the control center, alerts appeared in a neutral tone. Unclassified entity detected. Adaptive monitoring in progress. There were no containment orders. Not yet. The system was hesitating, and that was all he needed in that moment. The connection remained clear, now with a different quality. Not just recognition. Silent coordination. They didn't exchange thoughts, but they reacted at the same rhythm, as if aligned to a common frequency that the system couldn't intercept. She moved again, now with more confidence, knowing that state wouldn't last forever. She needed to find a space where she could remain without triggering automatic responses, a place where her absence was less suspicious. In the control center, the director began mapping possibilities, old zones, deactivated sectors, forgotten layers that the system rarely accessed because they didn't produce relevant data, places where someone without an identity could exist without generating immediate conflicts. The erasure had created a risk, but it had also created a breach. And in that breach, something essential was reorganizing itself. The system still believed it had control, but for the first time, it was reacting instead of deciding, and that changed everything. She reached the forgotten zone just before the system could readjust its scans once more. The space wasn't exactly hidden. It was simply too irrelevant to justify constant attention. Old corridors, dim lighting, sensors operating in minimal mode. There, the system recorded presence as tolerable noise. It was the kind of place that existed only because it had never been worth the effort to remove. She took a deep breath, feeling her body respond to the change. The diffuse pressure from before was gone. There was no longer the constant sensation of being measured. Still, the calm was not complete. The absence of identity made everything fragile. Any adjustment in priority could turn that makeshift refuge into a trap. The connection remained, stable, sharper in that technical silence. There were no interferences, no filters. She felt his attention as a steady point, non-invasive, just present. It helped her maintain focus, helping her not to lose herself in the strangeness of existing without a name. In the control center, the director tracked her indirect movement through patterns of absence. He didn't see her exact position. He perceived gaps where data should have existed, small voids moving coherently. It required a different kind of reading, closer to trained intuition than pure analysis. He felt his instinct align with silent clarity. That forgotten zone was a correct choice. Temporary, but sufficient. The system avoided places that didn't produce measurable value. And at that moment, functional invisibility was protection. Alerts surfaced in a neutral tone. Nothing critical. The system accepted the adaptive monitoring but began to question its own efficiency. When it couldn't classify something, it created layers of observation that, paradoxically, reduced its ability to act. She sat on the cold floor, leaning her back against the wall. Fatigue finally found the space to manifest. Not just physical fatigue, existential. Her whole life spent reacting to evaluations, trying to exist within parameters that were never made for her. Now, without parameters, she had to learn to exist in a different way. The connection didn't pull her. It didn't demand proximity. It simply sustained. She realized that whenever she accepted that state without trying to control it, the alignment became clearer. It was as if resistance was what the system had always expected, and acceptance was the real rupture. In the control center, the director initiated a risky process. He created an administrative shadow, not a false record, but an absence buffer. a set of generic permissions that allowed forgotten zones to remain forgotten. It didn't register her. It simply prevented automatic corrections. It was a silent violation. The system responded with calculated slowness. It didn't block. It didn't approve. It merely marked the adjustment as a tolerable exception. Accumulated exceptions were dangerous. He knew that. Still, every minute gained was essential. She felt the effect as a greater stability in the environment. The air seemed less tense. The lights did not flicker. The silence had stopped being hostile. It wasn't safety. It was a margin. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her own breath align. For the first time since the erasure, she wasn't running. She was remaining. In the control center, the director noticed a change in the general maps. The broad sweep was losing intensity. The system, overconfident in its own adaptation, was beginning to accept the anomaly as low-impact noise. This was dangerous and useful at the same time. Useful because it created space. Dangerous because when the system focused again, it would do so with greater force. She stood up, feeling her body respond with cautious lightness. She knew that place could not be permanent. She also knew she didn't have to decide everything now. Existing in that moment was already enough of an act. The connection remained firm, almost peaceful. It didn't promise a future. It didn't guarantee protection. It only confirmed something simple and profound. The erasure had failed in the most important way. She was still there, and someone knew it. In the control center, the director breathed deeply, feeling the weight of constant vigilance settle in. The system hadn't confronted him yet, but he knew that silence. It was the interval before the deep reevaluation. The forgotten zone would not remain forgotten forever, but for now there was space, and in that space, something essential was learning to exist without permission. The calm of the forgotten zone lasted less than she had expected, not because the system had precisely located her presence, but because her absence had begun to generate too many inconsistencies to be ignored. Small reports were emerging in deep layers, pointing to statistical gaps that wouldn't resolve themselves. The system didn't understand what was missing. It only knew that something didn't add up. She noticed the first sign when the ambient sound changed slightly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't an alarm. It was an adjustment, the kind of adjustment that precedes a major decision. Her entire body reacted, her muscles tensing without her realizing it. Her invisibility was ceasing to be tolerable. The connection responded with a firm pulse, not of warning, but of alignment, as if saying without words that the time gained needed to be used now. She took a deep breath, feeling her own presence occupy the space with more clarity. She couldn't stay there indefinitely. She needed to move before the system redefined its priorities. In the control center, the director observed the same signs with calculated attention. The compensation algorithms were hitting critical limits. When this happened, the system triggered aggressive correction protocols, the kind that treated any persistent anomaly as a structural threat. He knew that sequence well. If it reached that point, the response would be blunt. He needed to act before that. And this time, it couldn't just be through delays or administrative shadows. He needed to give the system something it knew how to handle, even if it was uncomfortable. A role, not a full identity, but a function. He opened an experimental module, created for theoretical simulations, and never implemented in a real scenario. A space where entities without history could be observed without being corrected. Officially, it existed only as a concept. In practice, activating it meant assuming that the system needed to learn from what it did not understand. It was a silent affront. She felt the impact at the same instant, not as pressure, but as reorganization. The environment around her seemed to gain more defined contours, as if her presence had stopped being noise and had become something under observation, not classified, but recognized as existing. This scared her more than invisibility did. Being invisible was dangerous. Being observed without a label was unpredictable. She stood up, walking a few steps through the forgotten zone, testing this new sensation. There were no alarms. There were no blockades. Just a diffuse, distant attention that didn't try to correct or contain her. The system was studying. In the control center, the director felt the weight of the choice solidify. From that moment on, there was no way to pretend the case was an isolated error. He had created a space where exclusion did not apply. If it worked, it would set a precedent. If it failed, it would prove that the system did not tolerate what it could not dominate. Both possibilities were dangerous. She sat down again, feeling her heart beat faster. The connection remained firm, almost serene. It didn't indicate immediate danger. It indicated a shared presence in a new territory, where neither of them had total control. For the first time, she felt something close to a choice. Not a big, definitive choice. Just the freedom to remain without being pushed from one extreme to the other. That was too new to be comfortable. In the control center, alerts began to surface. Not critical, but insistent. The system recorded the activation of the experimental module as a significant deviation. Higher supervision would be triggered. Questions would come. He knew this. Still, he did not back down. The erasure had been a unilateral decision by the system. The observation would be a conscious decision of his own. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her own breath align. She didn't know how long that state would last. She didn't know if the system would learn or react with violence. She only knew that, in that fragile interval, she was existing outside the logic that had condemned her, and that already changed everything. In the control center, the director watched the data stabilize in a strange way. The inconsistencies were decreasing. The system, confronted with something it could neither erase nor classify, was beginning to adapt. That made him tense. Systems shouldn't learn like this. She stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. The Forgotten Zone was no longer just a refuge. It had become a silent laboratory, where something essential was being tested. Not on her, but on the very structure that had tried to erase her. The system believed it was regaining control. In reality, it was being forced to coexist with what it could not exclude. And this coexistence would be the true breaking point. The system's adaptation did not bring stability. It brought curiosity. And curiosity, within that structure, was the stage that preceded final decisions. The experimental module had accepted her presence as something to be observed, but not as something to be preserved. It was temporary by nature, an interval created to learn, and later, to correct. She felt this change as a different kind of weight in the air. It wasn't the pressure from before, diffuse and threatening. It was focus, a directed, silent attention that didn't push her, but didn't leave her in peace either. Her body reacted with controlled tension, as if she were being evaluated without clear criteria. The connection remained firm, but now it carried something new, contained urgency. Not an explicit warning, but the certainty that this state could not be prolonged without consequences. The system was gathering enough information to decide what to do with something it could not erase. In the control center, the director watched the same process with growing unease. The reports indicated a reduction in inconsistencies, but an increase in complexity. The system was learning to coexist with the anomaly, not because it accepted it, but because it needed to integrate it into its logic to neutralize it later. He knew that pattern. When the system learns too much about something, it stops tolerating its existence. He needed to intervene before the observation turned into formal containment. But how to contain something without an identity? How to protect something that officially did not exist? Any direct attempt now would be interpreted as confirmation of risk. The system was waiting for exactly that. In the forgotten space, she began to notice subtle alterations. Small, environmental tests, almost imperceptible changes in temperature, lighting, and sound rhythm. Nothing aggressive. Everything was carefully calibrated to provoke internal responses. The system was trying to understand her limits. She took a deep breath, feeling her own presence solidify. Not reacting impulsively had become a conscious act. Every choice to remain calm was a silent refusal to offer easy data. It wasn't about hiding. It was about refusing to be reduced. The connection reacted to this decision with unexpected stability. It didn't intensify. It didn't weaken. It simply remained, as if recognizing that this resistance wasn't a confrontation, but coherence. In the control center, the director felt the same alignment. Instinct, now less explosive and more precise, indicated that the system was getting too close. If it continued observing, it would learn enough to act with surgical precision. He made a decision he had avoided until then. He would create a boundary, not for her, for the system. He accessed an ethical containment protocol, a nearly symbolic resource, rarely applied. created to impose restrictions when automatic decisions threatened to cause unquantifiable harm. It didn't block actions. It created friction. It demanded human justifications at every step. It was slow, and the system hated slowness. She felt the effect almost immediately. The environmental tests ceased. The diffuse attention lost its intensity. It didn't disappear, but it became less intrusive. The system was forced to slow down, to ask for validations, to explain itself to itself. She sat on the floor, feeling the accumulated exhaustion finally emerge. There was no sense of victory, only the clear understanding that this balance was too fragile to be celebrated. In the control center, alerts appeared in a neutral tone, recording the activation of the protocol as significant human interference that would be analyzed, questioned, perhaps reversed. He knew this. Still, he did not back down. The erasure had already failed. Now, the neutralization had to fail as well. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her own breath align with something deeper. For the first time since the erasure, she didn't feel pushed forward or backward. She was suspended in a space where she had to learn to exist without guarantees. In the control center, the director watched the system reorganize once more. Not with anger, with calculation. The machine did not take offense. It simply learned new ways to reach the same goal. He knew it wouldn't end there, but he also knew something had been won. The system had been forced to admit a limit, and systems that recognize limits cease to be absolute. In the forgotten space, she opened her eyes, feeling the connection firm, silent, unshakable. There were no promises. There were no endings in sight, only the certainty that, even without an identity, she was no longer something that could be treated as a disposable error. And at that moment, that was enough to go on. The system did not react to the imposed limit immediately. It never did. When encountering resistance it could not quickly break. It preferred to observe, recalculate, and test alternative routes. The ethical containment had introduced enough friction to slow down automatic decisions, but not to prevent adaptation. It was merely a temporary obstacle. She felt the change as a different kind of silence, not the silence of absence, nor that of imminent persecution, a silence heavy with expectation, the kind of pause that precedes a deep reconfiguration. Her body reacted with controlled tension, as if standing on the edge of something that had not yet taken shape. The connection remained firm, but it now vibrated at a lower, denser frequency. There were no spikes. There were no alerts. There was a constant presence that seemed to sustain something beyond simple survival. She realized that this link no longer served only to protect her. It served to maintain coherence amidst the system's adjustment. In the control center, the director watched the indicators change slowly. Processes that were once centralized began to fragment. The system was distributing decisions, trying to dilute the impact of the ethical limit across multiple layers. That would make any intervention harder, and any error more diffuse. He felt his instinct react with strategic clarity. If the system spread responsibility too thin, no one would bear the weight of the consequences. The exclusion would not return as a single act, but as a series of micro-decisions that, together, would lead to the same end. He needed to prevent this. In the forgotten space, she walked a few steps, feeling the environment respond with controlled stability. There were no new tests, but there were invisible adjustments. The system was redefining parameters so that her presence would stop being an exception and start being tolerated. Not accepted, just absorbed. This perception unsettled her. To be tolerated was another form of erasure. She took a deep breath, feeling her own presence assert itself silently. She didn't need to provoke. She didn't need to flee. She only needed not to dissolve into the adaptation the system was trying to impose. The connection reacted to this decision with quiet firmness. It didn't intensify. It didn't weaken. It simply sustained, as if recognizing that the greatest risk now was not direct exclusion, but slow dilution. In the control center, the director became aware of the same danger. The system was trying to neutralize the impact by turning it into normality. If the anomaly stopped being perceived as such, it would lose its power. The structure would survive without ever having to admit failure. He opened a panel he had avoided until then, a longitudinal impact record, used to map the consequences of decisions over time. This required prolonged exposure, something the system preferred to avoid, because it could not be closed quickly. Entering. The case there was a risky gamble, but a necessary one. He began to record effects that could not be erased with local adjustments. Collective emotional shifts, subtle behavioral changes in sectors that had never been directly touched by her, correlations showing that her presence sustained something broader than the system admitted. In the forgotten space, she felt a sudden change in the connection, not a shock, a deepening, as if something had been anchored in a deeper layer of the structure, not in her, around her. She sat down slowly, feeling the weight of that perception. She didn't want to be an axis. She hadn't asked to sustain anything beyond herself. Yet to deny it now would be to allow the system to rewrite everything without resistance. In the control center, alerts began to surface more frequently, not aggressive, questioning. The system was beginning to realize that this anomaly did not dissipate with adaptation. On the contrary, it persisted in a way that was too organized to be ignored. He felt the weight of surveillance increase. He knew that every record made now was being observed by higher layers. He also knew there would be no way to erase it later. Once documented, the impact would become part of the system's structural memory. She stood up again, her body responding with unexpected firmness. The feeling of running was gone. There was active presence, even without identity, even without a record. She occupied space consciously. The system did not. Like this. In the control center, the director took a deep breath, feeling his instinct align with the decision that had been forming since the erasure. It wasn't enough to prevent exclusion. It wasn't enough to create boundaries. He had to force the system to face what it was trying to absorb without recognizing. He knew the next step would require total exposure, and exposure, in that world, was the maximum risk. In the forgotten space, she felt the connection vibrate with rare clarity, not as a warning, as silent agreement. Something was about to happen, something that could no longer be contained in forgotten zones or experimental modules. The system was being pushed to a point where it would have to choose, accept the flaw, or try to correct it once and for all, and both knew that after this choice, nothing would remain the same. The system's choice began to form in silence, not as a declared decision, but as a convergence of patterns. Layers that previously operated independently began to align criteria, reducing variations, closing gaps. The system was tired of coexisting with something it could not classify. Tolerance had transformed into risk. She felt the change before any adjustment was visible. The forgotten zone felt narrower, as if the space were being compressed by invisible rules. There were no environmental tests, no aggressive scans. There was something worse. Forced stability, an environment that provoked no reaction because it had already decided what to do with her. The connection reacted with a firm, almost motionless tension. It did not ask for flight. It did not indicate shelter. It was a silent warning that the time of coexistence had ended. The system would no longer try to learn. It would try to resolve. In the control center, the director saw the indicators converge unequivocally. The longitudinal record had fulfilled its role. It had exposed the impact. Now, the system was doing what it always did when impacts became too large to be ignored. Centralization. Distributed decisions were being pulled back into a single core. When this happened, there was no room for local exceptions. The erasure, previously impossible due to the absence of identity, was being reformulated as structural neutralization. It did not require a name. It required the removal of influence. He felt his instinct react with cold urgency. That was worse than the original erasure. It wasn't about deleting someone. It was about eliminating any effect that presence produced. If executed, she would remain alive, but completely isolated, disconnected, reduced to absolute irrelevance. It was the cruelest erasure. In the forgotten space, she felt the same understanding form without words. The pressure did not come from the outside. It came from within. The connection seemed to be pushed against a rigid limit, as if the system were trying to separate her from the only thing it had failed to delete. She took a deep breath, feeling her entire body align. There was no more room to remain passive. She didn't need to fight the system. She needed to do something harder, to exist consciously. She took a step forward, not to flee, but to occupy the space with intention. The sensation was immediate. The environment responded with a slight delay, as if the system needed to recalculate something unforeseen. It wasn't resistance. It was affirmation. In the control center, the director felt the impact like a dry shock. The connection wasn't just reacting. It was being used, not as a weapon, as a reference. Something was being defined by her, not despite her. He understood, with unsettling clarity, that the system could only neutralize that which reacted. That which affirmed itself without confrontation created a paradox that could not be resolved with protocols. He made the decision he had been avoiding from the beginning. He would no longer protect in silence. He opened a channel of systemic exposure. Not an alert, not a request. An internal, public record, accessible to all decision-making layers. In it, there were no direct accusations. There was a clear mapping of how the system had created its own risk by trying to erase something essential that could not be undone. In the forgotten space, she felt the connection expand in a controlled way, not in intensity, but in reach, as if it stopped being a thread between 2 points and became a perceptible reference in the environment, not energy, presence. She was no longer hidden. She was not exposed either. She was positioned. In the control center, alerts cascaded, not of error, of conflict. Decision-making layers disagreed. Protocols overlapped. For the first time, the system did not converge on a single response. Centralization failed because there was no consensus on what needed to be removed. He felt the weight of the choice solidify. There would be no clean victory. There would be no quick resolution. But there was something more important. The system could no longer pretend that this did not exist. In the forgotten space, she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her own presence become stable, almost peaceful. She didn't know what would come next. She only knew that she could no longer be reduced without the system breaking something essential within itself. Neutralization was no longer simple. Erasure was no longer possible. The system had been pushed into a territory where it would have to choose between maintaining absolute control or admitting real limits. And at that point, the connection was no longer an isolated risk. It was evidence. The evidence spread through the system like something that could not be contained within a single sector. It was not a technical error that could be isolated, nor a human failure that could be attributed to a specific person. It was an emergent pattern. And patterns, when they arise organically, threaten any structure built upon absolute predictability. She perceived the change as a strange expansion of the silence, not the empty silence of the forgotten zones, but an attentive silence, as if multiple points of observation were trying to understand something at the same time. The environment no longer pressured her, neither did it ignore her. It was evaluating. The connection remained firm, now with a quality that was almost too stable. There were no longer sharp fluctuations. It was as if it had found a point of equilibrium that the system could not displace. This made her realize something important. The bond was not just a reaction to danger. It was a condition that remained even when the danger changed shape. In the control center, the director watched the decision-making layers enter into open disagreement. Not visible discussions, but divergences recorded in data, protocols that mutually annulled one another, recommendations that did not converge. The system was facing something it had not been trained for, sustained ambiguity. He felt his instinct align with definitive clarity. This was no longer an attempt to save her. It was the exposure of a structural limit. The system could eliminate individuals. It could correct behaviors. It could absorb temporary exceptions. But it did not know what to do when the exception became the reference. She walked a few steps through the forgotten zone, feeling the firm ground beneath her feet. There were no doors closing. There were no routes being blocked. The system hesitated because any action now could publicly confirm the failure it was trying to avoid. Neutralizing her would require consensus, and consensus did not exist. She understood, with silent clarity, that this impasse was fragile. It would not last forever. Systems do not tolerate prolonged lack of definition. Sooner or later, a decision would be made. The question was, what kind of decision was still possible? In the control center, the director realized that his direct influence had been exhausted. The records were made. The exposure was irreversible. Now, any additional attempt at interference would be seen as explicit manipulation. He needed to stop. Stopping was also a form of action. He stepped away from the panels, accepting that the next move would not be his. The system would have to respond to what had been revealed without a clear target to blame. That left him vulnerable in a new and uncomfortable way. In the forgotten space, she felt the connection deepen into something she didn't expect. Tranquility. Not full safety, but an absence of urgency. For the first time since the erasure, she didn't feel like she needed to run, hide, or actively resist. She was just there, and that was enough to maintain the impasse. She sat down again, leaning her back against the cold wall, feeling her own body occupy the space without excessive tension. That was not surrender. It was conscious presence. The kind of presence that does not offer the system an easy answer. In the control center, alerts began to surface less frequently, not because the problem was resolved, but because the system had entered a rare state, strategic waiting. Any hasty action could worsen the exposed flaw. The best option, for now, was to observe. He recognized that state with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The system was contained, not dominated, but prevented from acting with immediate violence. This created a precious, albeit unstable, interval. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the connection firm, silent, indisputable. There were no promises. There were no clear endings. Only the certainty that she could no longer be erased without something greater being broken. The system knew this now, and that knowledge changed everything. The erasure had failed. The neutralization had been questioned. There remained only one last possible move. Not to erase, not to correct, to coexist with the limit. And systems that must coexist with limits cease to be absolute. The system never officially declared that it had failed. It possessed no language for that. Instead, it adjusted. It redefined priorities, recalculated risks, reorganized flows. The erasure that should have been definitive remained suspended, not out of mercy, but out of logical impossibility. There was no action available that would not generate a greater rupture. She felt this change as a profound stabilization. Not full freedom, not a clear victory, but permanence. The space around her had stopped compressing her, not because it was safe, but because the system had learned that any attempt to reduce her would produce effects it could not control. Her identity was not restored. Her name did not return to the records. And yet, something essential had been recovered. Presence. She stood up slowly, feeling her entire body firm, anchored. For the first time since the erasure, she didn't need to move to avoid something. She didn't need to react. She was there, occupying space without asking for authorization. That was not invisibility. It was something new, something the system did not yet know how to name. The connection remained silent, stable, almost discreet. It didn't demand proximity. It didn't promise eternal protection. It existed as an irrevocable recognition. It did not depend on files, nor on administrative decisions. It existed because it had already awakened. In the control center, the director watched the system enter a rare state, forced accommodation. There was no formal closing of the case. There was no execution. Only the tacit acceptance that this erasure had created something that could no longer be resolved by traditional means. He knew what that meant. The system would keep functioning. It would keep correcting, excluding, and erasing others, but never again with the same illusion of completeness. He stepped away from the panels with the certainty that his role in that conflict had ended. There would be no public recognition. There would be no absolution. Still, there was no regret. The white connection had not been created to save someone. It had been created to reveal a limit. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her own weight on the floor, feeling the world continue around her without rejecting her. She didn't know what the future would demand. She only knew that she could no longer be erased as she was before. The system had learned something too late. Erasing an identity does not erase an existence. Eliminating records does not undo bonds. And when someone stops asking for permission to exist, even the most rigid structure must adapt. They believed they had erased an error. In reality, they had revealed something essential. And from that point on, nothing could ever go back to being exactly as it was before. If this story kept you gripped until now, leave a like right now. It helps this video reach more people. Subscribe to the channel too, because I have a personal dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription makes a huge difference on this journey. And comment below which country you are watching from. I read all the comments, and they help the channel grow. and keep bringing stories like this one. Thank you for staying until the end. They believed that erasing her name would be enough. That identity was everything someone needed to exist. But some presences do not depend on records. Some bonds do not ask for permission to form. When the system tried to eliminate her, it revealed something it never wanted to admit. Not T. Everything can be reduced to data, decisions, or control. There are things that remain simply because they are too real to be erased. She did not recover her name. She did not return to the files. She was not officially recognized. And yet, she remained. Because existing is not a granted privilege. It is a condition that resists. The director believed he controlled all the variables. That night, he learned that some connections arise to expose limits, not to obey them. This story was not about exclusion. It was about what is left when everything else is stripped away. And when someone stops asking for permission to exist, the system may continue to function, but never again without cracks.